The year is 1941. Nazi Germany has just invaded the Soviet Union. Millions of Soviet men are dying on the front lines. The Luftwaffe, Hitler's air force, dominates the skies. German bombers strike Soviet cities night after night, unopposed. The Red Army is desperate for pilots, for anyone who can fight back. But there is one resource the Soviet military refuses to use: women. Marina Raskova was not a typical Soviet citizen. She was a navigator, a record-breaking pilot, and a national hero. When Germany invaded, thousands of Soviet women volunteered to fight. They wanted revenge. They wanted revenge. But the Soviet military turned them away. Women, they said, were too weak for combat, too emotional, too delicate. Marina Raskova refused to accept this answer. She went directly to Joseph Stalin himself. She proposed something unprecedented in military history: 3 entire regiments of female combat pilots. Not support roles, not nurses or clerks. Combat pilots who would fly bombing missions against the German army. Stalin, desperate for any advantage in the war, agreed. He gave Raskova permission to form the regiments. But he gave her almost nothing else. No modern aircraft, no proper equipment, no support from the male-dominated Soviet Air Force. Marina Raskova began recruiting in October 1941. The response was overwhelming. Thousands of Soviet women volunteered. They came from universities, from factories, from farms. Some were experienced pilots. Most had never flown before. They were students, teachers, factory workers. The youngest was just 15 years old. They all shared one thing: an absolute determination to fight. The volunteers traveled to Engels, a town on the Volga River, for training. The conditions were brutal. Winter in southern Russia is merciless. Temperatures dropped to -40 degrees. The barracks had no heat. The women slept in their uniforms, huddled together for warmth. Food was scarce. Equipment was worse. They trained with whatever the military could spare, which was almost nothing. The male instructors were openly hostile. They believed women had no place in combat aviation. They made training deliberately difficult, hoping the women would quit. They assigned the hardest physical tasks. They mocked their flying skills. They predicted total failure. The women endured everything. They refused to quit. They refused to fail. They would prove everyone wrong. Marina Raskova organized 3 regiments. The 586th Fighter Regiment would fly interceptor missions. The 587th Bomber Regiment would fly heavy bombers in daylight raids. And the 588th Night Bomber Regiment would conduct night harassment missions against German positions. This 3rd regiment, the 588th, would become the most famous. They would become legends. The Germans would give them a name that would echo through history: Nachthexen, night witches. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment received the worst aircraft in the entire Soviet Air Force: the Polikarpov Po-2. This was not a combat aircraft. It was a training plane, designed in 1928 for teaching student pilots. Made of plywood and canvas, open cockpit, no armor, no radio, no guns. Maximum speed barely over 90 miles per hour. German fighters flew 3 times faster. The Po-2 was so slow, so primitive, that the Luftwaffe considered it a joke. But the women of the 588th would turn this primitive biplane into a weapon of terror. They would fly it into combat every single night for nearly 3 years. They would drop over 23,000 tons of bombs on German positions. They would fly over 24,000 combat missions, more than any other Soviet aviation unit. And they would earn the fear and respect of the entire German army. Their tactics were born of necessity. The Po-2 was too slow and fragile for conventional bombing. It couldn't fly high enough to avoid anti-aircraft fire. It couldn't fly fast enough to escape German fighters. So the women developed a new approach. They would fly at night, using darkness as protection. They would fly very low, just above treetop level, to avoid radar detection. They would cut their engines before reaching the target and glide silently toward German positions. The only sound would be the wind whistling through the wing struts, a soft whooshing sound, like a witch's broomstick sweeping through the night sky. The Germans were terrified. Night after night, they would hear that strange whistling sound in the darkness above them. Then bombs would fall, small bombs, not enough to destroy heavy equipment, but devastating to morale. The Germans could never predict when or where the attacks would come. They lost sleep. They grew paranoid. They began to believe Soviet witches were hunting them. They started calling the women Nachthexen, night witches. They spread rumors that the Soviet Union was using supernatural forces, that these pilots could see in the dark like cats, that they were given special drugs to eliminate fear. The truth was far more remarkable than any rumor. These were ordinary women performing extraordinary acts of courage, every single night. The missions were incredibly dangerous. The PO2 was made of wood and fabric. One tracer bullet could ignite the entire aircraft. There were no parachutes. The planes were too slow and flew too low for parachutes to work. If the aircraft was hit, if the engine failed, there was no escape. The pilots and navigators would die in the burning wreckage. Each crew consisted of 2 women, a pilot and a navigator. The navigator also served as the bombardier, manually dropping bombs over the side of the open cockpit. They worked in perfect coordination, flying barely above the ground in total darkness, navigating by stars and landmarks they had memorized during daylight reconnaissance, approaching enemy positions in complete silence, releasing bombs at precisely the right moment, then restarting the engine and climbing away before German searchlights could find them. The German response was overwhelming. They positioned anti-aircraft batteries around every military installation. They crisscrossed the night sky with searchlights, creating deadly webs of light that could blind pilots or expose them to anti-aircraft fire. They offered military decorations to any Luftwaffe pilot who could shoot down a night witch. Shooting down one female Soviet pilot was worth the same as shooting down 10 male pilots. The Germans were that desperate to stop them. But the night witches had developed tactics to counter every German defense. When searchlights tried to find them, they flew in groups of 3. 2 aircraft would deliberately fly into the searchlight beams, drawing fire and attention. While German gunners focused on these decoy aircraft, the 3rd plane would slip through in darkness and drop its bombs on the target. Then all 3 would scatter in different directions, making it nearly impossible for the Germans to pursue them all.
The women called this tactic the Dance of the Witches. They flew multiple missions every night, landing, refueling, reloading bombs, and taking off again. 8 missions per night was common. 10 or 12 missions was not unusual. Some pilots flew 15 missions in a single night. They would fly until dawn made it too dangerous to continue. Then they would sleep for a few hours during the day and fly again the next night. For months, for years. The physical and psychological exhaustion was crushing. Nadezhda Popova was one of the most famous night witches. She flew 852 combat missions, more than almost any other pilot in history, male or female. She was shot down multiple times. Her aircraft was hit by anti-aircraft fire 18 times. She crash-landed behind enemy lines and had to evade German patrols to return to Soviet territory. She saw friends and fellow pilots die beside her. She kept flying. When asked years later why she continued, she said simply, "It was my duty. It was what we were trained to do. There was a war to win." Irina Sebrova flew 1,008 combat missions. More than 1,000 times she climbed into that fragile wooden aircraft and flew into German fire. She once described what it felt like to fly those missions. Imagine flying a few meters above the ground in total darkness. Below you are trees, buildings, enemy positions. Any mistake means death. Above you are German fighters that can destroy your plane with a single burst of fire. Around you are hundreds of searchlights trying to find you, trying to blind you, and anti-aircraft shells exploding in every direction. You fly through this every night, sometimes 8 times in one night. This was our normal routine. Yevgenida Zhigulenko flew 968 missions. She later became a film director and made movies about her experiences. But she said no film could ever truly capture what it was like. People watch movies about aerial combat and they see drama, excitement, heroism. They don't see the hours of cold, the exhaustion so deep you can barely think, the terror that never goes away no matter how many missions you fly. They don't see your friends burning to death in aircraft just like yours, knowing that tomorrow it might be you. The casualties were devastating. Of the approximately 400 women who served in the 588th Regiment during the war, 32 were killed in combat. This might seem like a low number, but it represented months of constant loss. Every few weeks, another crew would fail to return. 2 more empty beds in the barracks. 2 more names added to the memorial. The surviving women would grieve briefly, then climb into their aircraft and fly again that night. Katya Ryaba and Nadia Ulyanova died together when their aircraft was caught in searchlights over a German position. German anti-aircraft gunners poured fire into their Po-2. The wooden aircraft disintegrated in mid-air. There was nothing left to bury. Their fellow pilots continued their bombing run, dropping bombs on the same German position that had killed their friends. Revenge was immediate. Tatiana Makarova and Vera Bellick were shot down by a German night fighter. The Luftwaffe had finally figured out how to intercept the slow Po-2 bombers. They used their own slow training aircraft, mounting machine guns on them. These German aircraft were slow enough to pursue the Night Witches. Makarova had no chance. Their burning aircraft fell into a forest. The Germans found the wreckage the next morning. They buried the 2 women with military honors, impressed by their courage. The psychological pressure was immense. Every night, climbing into that fragile aircraft, knowing you might not return. Watching friends die. Seeing aircraft explode or crash. The smell of burning wood and fabric. The screams over the radio as crews went down. Some pilots broke under the pressure. They developed what today would be called post-traumatic stress disorder. They couldn't sleep. They had nightmares. Their hands shook so badly they couldn't fly. The regiment had no mental health support. Pilots either continued flying or were removed from duty. Most continued flying. They felt they couldn't abandon their friends. But there were also moments of incredible camaraderie and even joy. Between missions, the women sang songs, told stories, celebrated birthdays. They formed bonds deeper than family. They knew they could trust each other absolutely. In the air, their lives depended on perfect cooperation. On the ground, they found comfort in shared experience. No one else, no man, could understand what they endured. Only each other. Several romances developed within the regiment. Women fell in love with each other, finding comfort and connection in the midst of war. These relationships were quietly accepted within the unit, though Soviet society at large would not have approved. The women protected each other's secrets. What happened in the Night Witches stayed in the Night Witches. Some of these wartime romances lasted for decades after the war ended. The Night Witches also developed a fierce rivalry with male Soviet pilots. The men initially refused to take the women seriously. They made jokes, they doubted their abilities, they predicted failure. The women responded by outperforming them. They flew more missions, they dropped more bombs, they achieved better accuracy. They suffered fewer losses relative to missions flown. Gradually, the male pilots' ridicule turned to respect. Some male pilots even requested transfers to fly alongside the Night Witches, considering it an honor. By 1943, the Night Witches had become legendary throughout the Red Army. Soviet propaganda celebrated them. Newspapers published their stories. Stalin himself praised their service. They became symbols of Soviet determination and female capability. Young girls across the Soviet Union dreamed of becoming night witches. The regiment received new volunteers constantly, replacing losses and expanding operations. The German response evolved as well. The Luftwaffe developed specific tactics for hunting night witches. They positioned night fighters along known flight paths. They improved searchlight coordination. They increased anti-aircraft defenses around high-value targets. They offered bounties for shooting down night witches. But nothing worked. The women were too skilled, too determined, too clever. They adapted to every German tactic, finding new ways to complete their missions. One of their most famous operations occurred during the Battle of Stalingrad. The city was surrounded. Soviet forces were desperately defending every building, every street. The night witches flew constant missions, bombing German positions inside the city. The close-quarters combat made their missions even more dangerous. They had to bomb targets just meters from Soviet positions. One navigation error could kill their own soldiers. They flew with perfect precision, night after night, helping Soviet forces hold the city. Another major operation was supporting the Soviet offensive at Kursk in 1943. This was the largest tank battle in history. Thousands of tanks clashed across hundreds of miles of open terrain. The night witches bombed German tank concentrations, fuel depots, ammunition dumps. They harassed German forces constantly, preventing them from resting or regrouping. Soviet commanders credited the night witches with significantly disrupting German operations during this crucial battle. As the war progressed and Soviet forces pushed westward, the night witches advanced with them. They flew missions over occupied Poland, Romania, Hungary, Austria. They bombed German positions all the way to Berlin. They witnessed the liberation of concentration camps. They saw the full horror of Nazi occupation. This only strengthened their determination. They had joined the war to defend their homeland. Now they fought to liberate Europe. The final months of the war were both triumphant and bittersweet. Victory was approaching. The night witches had survived years of combat. But losses continued right up to the end. In April 1945, just weeks before Germany surrendered, the regiment lost another crew. It seemed cruelly unfair. To survive so long, to fly so many missions, only to die when victory was so close. The survivors felt guilty. Why them? Why did they survive when so many others died? When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, the night witches had flown 24,000 combat missions. They had dropped 23,000 tons of bombs. They had conducted more combat missions than any other Soviet aviation regiment. 23 of their pilots were awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union, the nation's highest honor. Junior Lieutenant Irina Sebrova, Guards Captain Natalia Meklin, Junior Lieutenant Maria Smirnova, and 20 others. These women had proven themselves equal to any male pilot. They had shown that courage had no gender. But their struggle was not over. When the war ended, the Soviet military immediately disbanded the female combat regiments. Women were thanked for their service and told to return to traditional roles. The night witches were scattered across the Soviet Union. Many were sent back to their hometowns, back to factories and farms and schools. Their combat experience was suddenly considered irrelevant. The Soviet military decided that women flying combat missions had been a wartime necessity, not a precedent for the future. The male pilots they had served alongside received heroes' welcomes, parades, medals, promotions, career positions in the post-war military. The night witches received much less recognition. Some received medals, some received small pensions. But there were no parades specifically for them, no monuments. Their story was mentioned briefly in official histories, then largely forgotten. Soviet propaganda had celebrated them during the war.
After the war, their story became inconvenient. It challenged traditional gender roles. It suggested women could perform roles society wanted to reserve for men. Many night witches struggled after the war. They had spent years in constant danger, living on adrenaline, united by a clear mission. Suddenly, they were expected to return to normal civilian life, to get married, have children, work ordinary jobs. Some managed this transition, others never did. They had been warriors, they had been heroes. Now they were told to be housewives. The disconnect was profound and painful. Nadezhda Popota married another pilot after the war. They had a family. She rarely talked about her war experiences. When she did, people often didn't believe her. A grandmother who had flown over 850 combat missions, who had been shot down multiple times, it seemed impossible. Even her own grandchildren didn't fully understand what she had done until they were adults. She kept her medals in a drawer, rarely taking them out. Irina Sebrova became a doctor after the war. She said she had seen enough death and wanted to save lives instead. She worked in a small hospital in rural Russia. Her patients had no idea that their quiet doctor had once been one of the most decorated combat pilots in history. She preferred it that way. The war was past. She wanted to focus on healing, not on killing. Yevgenia Zhigolenko pursued her passion for film. She directed several movies, including one about the night witches, called In the Sky. The film tried to capture their experiences, but Zhigolenko later admitted it failed. She said there was no way to truly convey what those nights had been like. The cold, the fear, the exhaustion, the losses. Movies made it look dramatic and exciting. The reality had been mostly just terror and tedium. For decades, the story of the night witches remained obscure outside the Soviet Union. In the West, they were virtually unknown. American and British histories of World War II barely mentioned them. When they were mentioned, it was often with skepticism. Some Western historians doubted the Soviet accounts, suggesting the numbers were exaggerated for propaganda purposes. This dismissal was both sexist and inaccurate. The night witches' achievements were real and well documented. It wasn't until the 1990s, after the Soviet Union collapsed, that the full story began to emerge. Historians gained access to previously classified Soviet military records. They could interview surviving night witches without political restrictions. The evidence was overwhelming. The night witches had accomplished everything Soviet sources claimed and more. They had been one of the most effective combat aviation units of the entire war. Today, the surviving night witches are in their 90s or have passed away. Nadezhda Popova died in 2013 at age 91. Irina Sebrova died in 2000 at age 78. Yevgenia Zhigolenko died in 1994 at age 72. Most of the others are gone as well. But their story endures. It challenges assumptions about gender and combat. It reveals possibilities that many societies still resist acknowledging. It proves that courage, skill, and determination are not determined by gender. The night witches flew wooden biplanes against the most powerful military machine in the world. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and given equipment their enemies considered a joke. They were told they couldn't fight. They were told they would fail. They were told women didn't belong in combat. They proved every assumption wrong. They became one of the most feared and respected combat units in the entire Soviet military. Their legacy extends beyond their military achievements. They demonstrated that women could perform in combat roles just as effectively as men. They challenged deeply ingrained cultural assumptions about gender capabilities. They inspired generations of women to pursue careers in aviation, military service, and other fields traditionally reserved for men. They showed that heroism wears many faces, but perhaps their most important legacy is simply their story. A story of ordinary women who did extraordinary things, who faced impossible odds and refused to surrender, who flew into darkness and terror night after night after night,
who lost friends and kept flying, who were afraid but flew anyway, who were told they couldn't and proved they could. The Night Witches, Stalin's avenging angels, the terror of the Wehrmacht. 24,000 missions, 23,000 tons of bombs, 3 years of night combat, all in wooden biplanes that shouldn't have been able to fight at all by women who weren't supposed to be warriors, all because Marina Raskova refused to accept no for an answer, all because 400 Soviet women decided they would rather die fighting than live in fear. Their aircraft were destroyed after the war. The last PO-2 bombers were scrapped or put in museums. But you can still hear them if you listen. On quiet nights, some say you can hear a soft whistling sound, like wind through wires, like a witch's broomstick sweeping through the darkness. It's the sound of the Night Witches, forever flying their missions, forever defending their homeland, forever refusing to be forgotten. This is their story. The women who flew into darkness. The women who terrorized an empire. The women who proved that the sky has no gender. The Night Witches. May we never forget them.